My name is Clara Monroe, and on the day we gathered to read my mother's will, I thought I was there to grieve. Instead, I watched my father and his new wife recoil in fury when they realized they'd lost control over me, and over everything she left behind. They planned to erase her legacy, but she left me the key to fight back. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, let me take you into the moment everything changed for me. It was the kind of office where old money and quiet power hung in the air. Walls lined with mahogany bookshelves, certificates in heavy gold frames, and windows taller than a person. We sat at a long conference table that somehow felt more like a battlefield than a place of mourning. I was 19, barely holding myself together in a black dress that still smelled faintly of my mother's perfume. She had passed just 2 weeks earlier. A quiet but fierce woman who built her life around books, hard work, and me. Her name was Julia Monroe, and she had run her bookstore like it was a cathedral. Now she was gone, and the man who once promised her forever sat across from me like a stranger. My father, Richard Monroe, looked polished as ever, silver hair slicked back, cufflinks glinting, like he was ready for a photo shoot rather than a funeral follow-up. Beside him, perched in uncomfortable elegance, was his new wife, Marlene. All bone structure and Botox, not a single tear streak in sight. They didn't speak to me as I entered, just nodded tight, rehearsed. I almost turned around. The lawyer, Mr. Halperin, cleared his throat. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." "You don't say." He opened the file with a slow, practiced motion and began reading. I barely processed the legal jargon at first, just snippets, fragments of what my mother must have spent weeks preparing. "To my daughter, Clara Monroe." The shift was instant. Marlene flinched. Richard's brow twitched. "I leave full ownership of the Monroe residence located on Chestnut Street, as well as all remaining proceeds from the bookstore's liquidation. These assets are to be used solely for Clara's educational and personal living expenses, per my wishes. Richard Monroe is to serve no fiduciary role." You could have heard a pin drop, if not for the sharp gasp from Marlene. "What?" she blurted, before her manicured hand flew to her mouth. Richard turned red, not just his face, but his whole neck. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might snap a molar. I gripped the edge of my chair like I was on a ledge. I hadn't known. She hadn't told me. I assumed everything would go through him. That's what stepmothers and fathers do, right? But no, my mother had known better. She had known them too well. "Are you sure this is accurate?" Richard's voice was cold, controlled, but just underneath, cracking. Mr. Halperin gave him a look that was both bored and unbothered. This was her final signed document, notarized, witnessed. "I just think," Marlene said quickly, a saccharine lilt entering her voice, "that perhaps there's been a mistake." I turned to her slowly. "Mistake?" I asked quietly. She blinked, smiled too fast. "Of course, sweetheart, your mother was so emotional near the end. Maybe she wasn't thinking clearly. She was more clear-headed than any of us," I said before I could stop myself. "Right up to the end." Richard stood suddenly, hands flat on the table. "We need to discuss this privately," he told the lawyer. "You're welcome to," Mr. Halperin replied, "but the terms are final." The room shrank around us. I could feel their fury, like heat off a stovetop, all directed at me, as if I'd done something wrong by merely existing in the will. I sat still. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I just breathed. Because somewhere deep down, beneath the shock and the ache, a truth was settling in my bones. She trusted me. She knew what they'd try. And now it was my turn to decide what kind of daughter I was going to be. After the will reading, I didn't go back to campus. I couldn't. I needed something quieter than dorm chatter and long hallways full of curious eyes. So I went home. Not to Richard and Marlene's new condo in the high-rise downtown. No, I went to her house. Our house in the Garden District. The place that smelled of aged paper, cinnamon, and the faintest hint of sandalwood from the candles my mom used to burn late at night while balancing bookstore receipts. It had always been too big for just the two of us, but she never once talked about selling it. "Books make a home feel lived in," she used to say, brushing dust from old paperbacks like they were artifacts. "You fill a room with stories, it never echoes." Now it echoed. The living room was untouched. Her armchair with the faded floral cushion. Her reading glasses folded beside a half-finished copy of The Mists of Avalon. A teacup still on the side table, dried leaves clinging to the porcelain like they didn't want to let go either. I walked through the house slowly. Not searching, just listening. Grief wasn't loud in this place. It was soft. A weightless ache that settled in behind the ribs and didn't ask permission. Upstairs, in her bedroom, I found the letters. A shoebox beneath her bed, stuffed with envelopes tied with blue ribbon. Each one addressed to me. Most postmarked from cities she'd traveled to when she was younger, others newer, never sent. I sat on her neatly made bed, sunlight striping the quilt, and read. Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry. Her handwriting hadn't changed. Loopy elegant with the occasional ink smudge where she'd paused too long. You are stronger than you know, and smarter than most people will ever admit. Don't let charm fool you, especially when it's wearing your father's face. I blinked hard. Her words weren't angry. They were protective, measured, like she'd seen something long before I ever dared to. There was one letter dated exactly 2 weeks before her death. It was shorter. I've made arrangements. They'll be upset. Stay grounded. You have every right to what's yours. Don't give it up, not even to keep the peace. And then, at the bottom, barely legible, don't trust what smiles too easily. I set the letter down like it might burn me. The house was mine. The will was real. But something about the way she'd worded that last part, something in my gut twisted. Outside, the wind rustled through the crepe myrtle trees, their leaves brushing against the windows like whispers. I wandered into the kitchen. There I found the little notepad by the fridge where she used to scribble weekly notes. Grocery lists, quotes, jokes. One page, half torn and curling at the edges, read, "They only show up when there's something left to take." Marlene's voice echoed in my memory, syrupy and sweet. "We just want what's best for you." I opened the pantry. Canned soup, expired crackers, boxes of her favorite tea. I touched the corner of a shelf and pulled back with a sniff of dust on my fingers. This wasn't just a house. It was her last stand. And now it was my battlefield. I looked out the window toward the narrow driveway. My beat-up car sat alone. Richard's sleek black Lexus had never once been parked here. He used to say the neighborhood was too historic for his taste. Translation, he couldn't be bothered. I closed the blinds, then went upstairs again. In my old bedroom, still full of posters and books and the terrible art I made in 8th grade, I sat at my childhood desk and pulled out a pad. I didn't know what the next move was, but I knew one thing: they weren't done. Not Richard. Not Marlene. And if they wanted to come for what my mother left me, they'd have to go through me first. The kitchen used to feel warm. Sunlight always streamed through the window above the sink, hitting the tiled floor just right, like the house was trying to hug you. I used to sit at the table doing homework while Mom kneaded dough or steeped tea, humming whatever tune was stuck in her head. Now, the light still came in, but it felt clinical. Marlene was already there when I walked in, perched on the bar stool like she'd always belonged. A pink silk scarf tied around her neck, oversized sunglasses still on her face even indoors. She had a smile that was all porcelain and patience. Too wide, too careful. "Clara," she said sweetly, stirring her coffee. "I didn't hear you come down." I nodded, grabbed a mug from the cabinet, and poured myself a cup. The air smelled like hazelnut creamer, not the French roast my mother used to drink. Richard followed a moment later in a polo shirt and khakis that looked suspiciously out of place in this old house. He moved casually, like we weren't still vibrating from the shock of the will. He poured his coffee. No greeting, no glance in my direction. "So," Marlene began, her tone light and syrupy, "we were just talking about how things might work now that everything's settled." My stomach tightened. "Settled," I echoed. Richard finally spoke. "The house, the estate, your finances. You've got a lot on your plate, Clara." "Right," Marlene chimed in, leaning forward as if we were two girlfriends swapping gossip. "And we were thinking now that you're, flush, maybe we could all pull together." I sipped my coffee to keep from answering too fast. She smiled wider. "I mean, this old place needs some love. The porch is sagging, the roof's questionable, and goodness knows the water pressure upstairs is a nightmare." I kept my face neutral. "It's held up fine until now." "Of course," she said with a laugh just a decibel too loud. "But still, maybe now's the time for some updates, a little investment to boost its value." Richard leaned against the counter. We figured you might help out with some of the bills, pitch in family style. There it was, no direct ask, no figures, just a trap dressed in casual phrasing and friendly smiles. I'll think about it, I said, voice cool. Marlene reached across the table and lightly touched my hand. Her nails were painted a soft coral, but her grip had teeth. No rush, honey, we just want what's best for all of us. My skin crawled. Richard took another sip and added, almost as an afterthought, and we're still figuring out Marlene's situation, too. The trust she expected, well, it seems your mother didn't make provisions. She didn't, I said plainly. He blinked. I stood and rinsed my mug. The kitchen felt smaller now, like the walls were listening. Richard cleared his throat. This house, it has a lot of memories. I'd hate to see it fall into disrepair. I turned, forcing a calm smile. Then it's a good thing Mom left it to someone who actually remembers them. Silence. Marlene's smile slipped just a crack. I excused myself before the tension turned solid. Upstairs, I shut my bedroom door and leaned against it, heart pounding. They were watching me, waiting for me to slip, to soften. But Mom hadn't raised a fool, and this wasn't just about bills or home repairs. It was about control. They'd lost the legal game. Now they were trying a slower tactic, guilt, pressure, politeness with sharp edges, but I'd seen it, felt it in their voices. I wasn't their daughter, I was their opportunity, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. The letter came in a plain white envelope buried between junk mail and a subscription card addressed to occupant. No logo, no return address, but the name on the sender line stopped me cold. H.A. Lively, CPA. I hadn't heard that name in years. Mr. Lively had been my mom's accountant since before I was born. He used to drop by the bookstore every quarter, briefcase in hand, sipping chamomile tea while talking about fiscal flow like it was a Shakespeare sonnet. I remembered him being quiet but kind. The kind of man who didn't waste words, but when he did speak, you listened. I opened the envelope at the kitchen counter, still half expecting another vague notice or veiled invoice from Richard's side of the world. Inside was a single page, typed. Clara, your mother asked me to send this to you after her passing. She left explicit instructions not to inform anyone else. Attached are the records for a separate account opened in your name 5 years ago. Your mother sold the bookstore before her illness worsened. She insisted the proceeds be reserved exclusively for your education. She was concerned that others might attempt to influence or redirect the funds. The account is under your full legal control. You will find her signed authorization attached, as well as the banking contact to access the balance. I'm sorry for your loss. She was fiercely proud of you. Warmly, Harold Lively, I read it 3 times. Then once more aloud, like hearing it might make it more real. She'd planned for this. For them. She'd sold her dream, the bookstore she built with her bare hands, and tucked the money away where they couldn't touch it. And she hadn't told me. Not because she didn't trust me, but because she didn't trust them. There was an attachment, a scan of her signature dated exactly 2 days before her last hospital stay. Next to it, a notarized confirmation of the account. The name of the bank branch was downtown, just blocks from Chilene's campus. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, shoved the letter inside, and drove with my heart pounding like a war drum. The bank was cool and clean and too bright. A glass wall separated the waiting room from the teller stations, and a woman with neat braids and a name tag that read Angie ushered me to a private office when I explained why I was there. I handed over my ID, the letter, and the documents. She tapped quietly on her keyboard, frowned, then smiled. Yes, she said, confirming the account. It's active. The balance has been untouched since it was opened. She turned the monitor slightly so I could see. My breath caught. It was more than I expected, more than enough to finish school, enough to start over if I needed to. I'd like to keep it where it is, I told her, voice steady, but I want the passwords changed, and no one else is to have access, verbal or otherwise. Already done, she said, clicking one last time. Your mother specified that no third-party authorizations be permitted without your written consent. We've honored that. She slid the paperwork across the desk. I signed, hands shaking, not from fear, from clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't ask questions, it demands answers. I left the bank with my bag pressed tight to my chest, my mother's letter safe inside. For the first time since the funeral, I could breathe, not freely, not completely, but enough to remember who I was. Enough to remember who she raised me to be. That night, I set the documents on my desk and lit one of her old candles. Sandalwood and amber, like she was standing right behind me. Richard had dismissed this as irrelevant paperwork. Marlene had smiled through gritted teeth while suggesting we pull together. But now I had something solid, something they couldn't bend or bury. They weren't just after my inheritance. They were trying to erase the boundary my mother drew with trembling hands in her final days. And I had just found the blueprint to stop them. Dinner that night smelled like pot roast and performance. Marlene had set the table with my mother's china. The blue and white plates only came out twice a year, Thanksgiving and birthdays. Seeing them in Marlene's hands, arranged around a dish she hadn't cooked in this kitchen before, made something inside me tighten. She'd set 3 places, Richard at the head, hers beside him, me alone across the table. No one mentioned the will or the bank account, or the letter I hadn't told them about yet. "Clara," Marlene said brightly, ladling gravy like we were on some kind of cooking show. "I'm so glad you're here tonight. It feels nice, like family again." I didn't respond. I focused on my napkin, then the steam rising from the plate. The food was fine, flavorful even, but it sat on my tongue like obligation. Richard poured wine, too much into Marlene's glass, too little into mine. He sat down with a sigh, cracking his neck like he'd just finished a hard day at work. "How are your classes?" he asked. The question sounded rehearsed. "They don't start for another week," I replied. He nodded like he knew that already. The silence stretched. Then Marlene pounced, her voice sugar-coated with just enough false warmth to make my skin crawl. "You know, Clara," she said, cutting into her meat with delicate, deliberate strokes, "this house is a real gem, but old homes, they're like temperamental artists. One moment they're fine, the next boom, plumbing's gone, roof leaks, you name it." I kept chewing, slowly. "I've been thinking," she continued, tapping her fork against her plate for rhythm, "maybe it's time to update some things, a fresh coat of paint, modern wiring, that sort of thing." Richard chimed in, as if on cue. "We know a great contractor. He did wonders with our condo downtown." "Exactly," Marlene beamed. "And since you've got your college fund all sorted, thank goodness for your mother's planning, maybe you'd consider co-signing a small repair loan, just to get ahead of any, surprises." My fork stopped midair. There it was, wrapped in family language, dipped in gravy, presented under candlelight. A small repair loan, co-signed by me, using my name, my assets, my mother's last gift. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said calmly. Marlene blinked like I'd misheard her. "It wouldn't be a burden," she said quickly. "You wouldn't have to pay anything, of course, just your name for security." Richard cleared his throat. "It's just paperwork, Clara. Banks like guarantees." I set my fork down slowly. "I'm not interested," I said. "I have school, and this house is fine as it is." Marlene's smile faltered, just a hairline crack, but she recovered. "Of course," she said, tucking a curl behind her ear. "We just wanted to offer, thought it might help everyone." Richard changed the subject, something about property taxes, the Saints' upcoming season. I didn't follow, the roast cooled on my plate. The wine turned sour in my mouth because it wasn't just a question, it was a test. Would I bend? Would I give an inch? They were looking for cracks in the foundation my mother left behind, but I wasn't giving them anything. After they cleared the dishes, I lingered in the dining room, letting the quiet settle. The chandelier above me swayed ever so slightly, draft from the hallway maybe, or the ripple of something else. I looked around the room. The windows, the hutch, the old grandfather clock that never quite kept time. This was my mother's home, and now it was mine. They could eat at her table, speak in her kitchen, smile through gritted teeth, but they would never own what she gave me. Not through charm, not through guilt, and definitely not through a family investment. It was Aunt Vivian's porch that finally let me breathe. Her house sat at the edge of the garden district, just shy of the oak canopied bend where the sidewalks cracked from roots pushing up through old bricks. Everything about it smelled like lavender and lemon oil, the scent of someone who cleaned to think. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been expecting me all morning. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, pulling me into a soft hug. "You've got your mother's eyes, same storm behind them." Vivian wasn't like Marlene. She didn't talk to fill silence. She let moments land, settle, shift. Her hair was silver now, twisted into a low bun. She wore a cotton blouse, no jewelry, and spoke with that patient drawl I remembered from childhood sleepovers and bookstore late nights. We sat on her wide porch with 2 cups of tea and a plate of shortbread she claimed she didn't remember baking. Cicadas hummed in the trees. A gentle breeze swept through the wind chimes by her door. It was quiet enough to feel what I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. Exhaustion, sadness, rage. "I read the will," I said, hands wrapped around the mug. "They didn't take it well." She nodded, her eyes never leaving mine. "Richard always believed he could outlast her, not love her, not outthink her, just wear her down." That landed harder than I expected. "He used to disappear," I said, voice low, "months at a time. Then show up again like nothing had happened." Vivian's mouth tightened. "Your mother never told you everything. She wanted you to love him, or at least not fear him." I looked at her sharply. "Fear." She nodded slowly, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "When our father died, Richard handled the estate. We trusted him. Didn't think to double-check what he filed. Until months later, I found paperwork with forged signatures. Mine, yours, even your mother's." The words rang like a bell in my head. I remembered her whispering fights with my mom behind the bookstore counter. The envelopes passed quietly, slipped beneath novels. Her sudden appearance every time tax season rolled around. "You think he'd do it again?" I asked, heart pounding now. Vivian met my eyes, steady and sure. "He's already trying, isn't he?" I told her about the dinner, the loan, the suggestion to co-sign. She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "Richard doesn't steal like a thief. He wraps it in charm, in paperwork, in just sign here, sweetheart." My hands trembled slightly. "And Marlene? She's his mirror. She learned from him, smiles like safety, speaks like she's on your side, but there's always a hook beneath her praise." I stared out at the street, watching a child on a scooter zip past 2 parked cars. The world kept turning, but mine felt like it was cracking at the edges. "What do I do?" I asked. Vivian reached beneath her chair and pulled out a folder. "I hoped I wouldn't need to give you this, but your mother sent me copies of everything. Property records, bank statements, and this." She handed me a small thumb drive. "She said, Vivian, if they come after Clara, make sure she knows where the real story starts." I took the folder with both hands, the weight of it heavier than it looked. "She trusted me," I said quietly. "She did," Vivian replied. "But more importantly, she trusted you. That's why she left it all in your name. Not to burden you, to protect you." We sat there for a long time. The sun shifted lower, the cicadas grew louder. Vivian didn't try to wrap it up with hope or advice. She just placed her hand over mine and squeezed. "Be careful," she said. "They don't like losing." That night, back at the house, I locked my door for the first time in days. I opened the folder on my desk and scrolled through the contents of the drive. It wasn't just financial data. It was history, dates, signatures, records of every time Richard had tried to rewrite the truth. And this time, he was trying to rewrite me. But now I had the proof. When Richard knocked on my bedroom door, I already knew something was coming. He never knocked just to talk. Not unless there was something he wanted and couldn't take without looking polite. I opened the door a few inches, enough to see his expression, tight and rehearsed. "We should talk," he said, with the kind of flat warmth that meant he'd practiced this in the mirror. I stepped aside, let him in, watched as he paced once, twice, before sitting on the edge of my mother's antique chaise like he didn't quite belong in the room, which he didn't. "I spoke with a friend," he began, smoothing invisible lint from his slacks. "A legal consultant, someone who's reviewed estates like this before." I didn't say anything. Let him fill the silence. "And he suggested," Richard continued, "that we meet with a different attorney, someone objective, just to make sure everything's airtight." I raised an eyebrow. "You think the will isn't airtight?" "No," he said too quickly. "I mean, yes, of course it's legal, but your mother was sentimental. Sometimes that clouds judgment." "She was more clear-headed than either of us," I replied. He smiled tightly. "Which is exactly why I want you to be protected. These things can be complicated. Legal language, asset transfer, tax implications." "Funny," I said, crossing my arms. "You didn't seem concerned about my protection when you tried to get me to co-sign a loan." His eyes flared just for a second, then smoothed again. "I overstepped," he said calmly. I admit that I let stress get the better of me, but this is about clarity. You're young, Clara. You've inherited a lot, and I don't want to see you misstep because of inexperience. Ah, there it was. The real tone beneath it all. I took a breath, pretended to soften. Okay, I said, sitting on the edge of my desk. Let's meet him. Richard blinked, not expecting me to agree so fast. But I'll need to review any documents ahead of time, I added. I'm not signing anything on the spot. Of course, he said, too eagerly. Of course, sweetheart, we're all on the same side here. No, we weren't. But I just bought myself a front row seat to whatever game he was playing. That night, I spread documents across my bed. Will copies, account statements, the files Vivian gave me. I highlighted inconsistencies, flagged anything involving Richard's name, and drafted a list of questions for the meeting he proposed. The next morning, I called Aunt Vivian. He wants to take me to a new lawyer, I told her. Silence. His name's Mr. Gaines, I added. Sound familiar? Vivian let out a slow breath. Gaines is smooth, expensive, keeps bad clients out of court. If Richard's using him, it's not for your benefit. My pulse quickened. I won't go in blind, I said. You won't go in alone, she replied. 2 days later, Richard slid a manila envelope under my bedroom door. It contained the meeting details, Thursday at 11:30 at Gaines & Associates. Also included a brief letter printed on thick stationery. It used vague legal phrasing, clarification of provisions, streamlining of asset protections, minimizing liability. Nowhere did it say what they wanted from me, but I already knew. They wanted me to sign something small-looking, safe-sounding, something that would crack open the gate to everything my mother sealed shut. I set the envelope down and looked around my room, the same room where I learned to read, where my mother braided my hair while I studied for spelling bees, where she whispered, "You can be anything," like a promise. And now it was my war room. Documents taped to the walls, notes tacked on corkboard. My laptop opened to a timeline of events, cross-referenced with financial records. They wanted a quiet signing. They were getting a quiet storm. The waiting room smelled like polished wood and lemon cleaner. Gaines & Associates sat on the 12th floor of a sleek downtown building that looked more like a luxury spa than a law office. Quiet jazz played through hidden speakers. Everything gleamed. Too clean, too careful. Marlene had worn white, not cream, not ivory. Stark, purposeful white like innocence pressed and ironed into fabric. She smiled like she'd already won. Richard looked bored, flipping through a glossy magazine, but his foot tapped nonstop. And me? I wore black, not for mourning, for armor. The receptionist, a young man with nervous energy and a headset, waved us in. "Mr. Gaines will see you now." His office was a temperature drop from the lobby, sleek lines, tall windows, a glass table instead of a desk. He stood as we entered, a tall man with thin wire glasses and a voice like polished gravel. "Clara," he said smoothly, "I'm so glad you could make it. Please have a seat." I sat, not too comfortably, just enough to look like I was listening. He glanced at Richard. "Shall we begin?" Gaines slid a folder toward me. Inside, 4 pages, double-spaced, highlighted. "Just a small agreement," he explained. "No changes to the will, simply a clarification of language, streamlining of distribution timelines. Ensures everyone's protected, especially you." "Looks harmless, doesn't it?" Marlene chimed in. "It's practically a formality." I flipped through the pages, the words blurred after a while, too clean, too vague. "Why am I listed as a secondary beneficiary in Clause 3? I asked. Richard shifted. Gaines smoothed his tie. "Just a placeholder, legal convention, the estate's already yours." I met his eyes. "Then why change anything?" Gaines' smile never wavered. "Sometimes clarity prevents conflict." I could feel it, that twist in my stomach. The one that tells you this isn't right, even if you can't prove it yet. I reached for my bag, pulled out a copy of the original will, laid it on the table next to the clarification. "The original's already clear," I said. "Anything else feels like an edit." Gaines opened his mouth, but didn't get far. "May I step out for a moment?" I asked, already rising. "Just need a breather." "Of course," he said, but his tone clipped. As I walked down the hallway, I could feel their eyes on me. Marlene's smile gone. Richard whispering something behind his hand. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me. My heels clicked down the tiled floor. And then the dizziness hit, a rush of heat, a spinning moment of vertigo, like my blood pressure had dipped from the tension pressing in on all sides. I ducked into the bathroom, locking the stall. My hands shook as I pulled the document from my bag again. 4 pages, clean font, too few specifics. I took a breath. No tears, not here, not now. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed Aunt Vivian. Nothing, straight to voicemail. I called again, still nothing. Something inside me tipped toward panic. I looked at the paper again, then the signature line. They'd even typed in my name. All I had to do was pick up the pen on the table and sign. That was the trick. Make it look easy. Make it look safe. Make me the one who handed over the keys to my own future. Outside the stall, I heard the creak of the door. Slow, soft, footsteps, just one pair, too quiet for a receptionist, too calm for coincidence. I held my breath, then silence. The kind that hums when something's about to happen. I waited until the footsteps stopped, then counted to 10. Then another 10. Just long enough for the walls of the bathroom stall to feel too narrow, too close. My heartbeat had slowed, but the prickle at the back of my neck hadn't gone away. I slipped the folded document back into my bag, zipped it carefully, and stood. When I stepped out, the room was empty. No one at the mirror. No shadow behind the door. The air hung heavy, like someone had just left but wanted me to feel like they were still there. I turned the faucet on, ran cold water over my wrists like my mother used to when I got dizzy as a child. It grounded me. A little. In the mirror, I barely recognized myself. I looked like her. Like my mother when she was younger. Same sharp cheekbones, same eyes that saw too much too soon. But today, I also looked like someone who had finally stopped pretending to be naive. When I opened the bathroom door, the hallway outside was different. Not visibly, not obviously, but there was a stillness, like a held breath. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, it's calculated. I took a step. The silence swallowed it. Voices floated faintly from the conference room behind the frosted glass, but they were hushed now. Strained. I walked slowly down the hallway, my fingers brushing the edge of the chair rail as I passed. The plush carpet muffled my steps. Then I heard it, a sharp whisper. "No, she hasn't signed anything," I froze. Was that Marlene? Another voice cut in lower, tense. "Then stall her if she calls someone," I edged closer. The office door was open an inch, just enough to see movement. A glimpse of Marlene's profile, her mouth tight. Richard with his back turned, hands gesturing wildly. Mr. Gaines stood between them, face pale beneath his polished calm. Then something thudded, maybe a hand on the desk. I stepped back fast, pressing myself to the wall. The voices dropped, then rose again. I couldn't catch words now, just heat. Whatever mask they'd worn before, smooth charm, polite concern, it was slipping. Cracking. They hadn't expected me to walk out of that room, to take a breath, to think. I pulled my phone from my bag and tried Vivian again. Still nothing. The silence on the line now felt sharper than the noise in the hallway. I backed away from the door, slow, quiet steps down the hall toward the waiting room. The receptionist was gone. The jazz had stopped. The stillness wrapped around everything. I didn't go back to the conference room. Not yet. Instead, I walked down the corridor toward the elevator bay, heart thudding in time with each step. Then something strange happened. The elevator doors pinged open. Inside, 2 men in suits, not clients, not lawyers. Something else in the way they moved, deliberate, scanning, calm in a way that made my skin prickle. They stepped out without a word and turned left, toward the offices. I stood frozen by the elevator, one hand clutching my bag, the other hovering above the call button. Then I heard it, raised voices. Louder now, not angry, panicked. Another door opened sharply, papers spilled. A woman gasped, footsteps, rapid now. And then silence again, the elevator beside me pinged. I didn't step inside, not yet. Instead, I turned back down the hallway, slowly approaching the corridor where I'd left them. That's when I saw it. Mr. Gaines' office door was open wide now. The chair knocked over. Richard standing with his hands slightly raised. Marlene seated, her makeup smudged, eyes wide with something too messy to be fake. Shock. Fear. Maybe both. And Gaines, gone. The receptionist was back at his desk now, whispering into a phone, his eyes darting toward the hallway like he didn't know whether to run or stay seated. Something had shifted. Not just the tone, the entire room, the building. It felt electric, like something long buried had just broken through the floor. I stayed in the hallway, just watching. waiting, because for the first time they didn't know what was coming next. But I had a feeling I was about to find out. You know that feeling when a room goes quiet, not because people have stopped talking, but because they're afraid someone else might start. That's what it felt like in Mr. Gaines' hallway. The air had shifted. The lighting hadn't changed, and yet everything looked different, sharper, exposed. Like the truth was finally tired of waiting in the wings. I stepped closer, slow and silent, stopping just outside the doorframe. Inside, Richard stood rigid, his jaw tight, hands no longer raised but gripping the edge of Gaines' desk. Marlene sat frozen in her chair, legs crossed, but her foot shook uncontrollably. Her mascara had started to streak, and she kept dabbing at her face with a tissue that was already half dissolved. Gaines wasn't behind the desk anymore. He stood at the window, phone in one hand, the other buried deep in his pocket. He turned slightly, his voice low but clipped. "Yes, they're here now. No signatures yet, yes, under the pretext of clarification." He paused, eyes flicking toward me as he noticed my reflection in the glass. I stepped in fully now. Calm, controlled, my mother's daughter. Richard tried to recover, plastering on that fatherly concern like a second skin. "Clara, everything's fine. We were just... What's going on?" I asked. Gaines hung up without answering. Marlene opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes darted from me to Richard, then to the hallway behind me as if someone might burst through and save her. "Who were you calling?" I asked Gaines directly. His voice was smoother than it had any right to be. "My compliance office. Routine protocol. Since when do estate clarifications require compliance calls?" Silence. Then, suddenly shouts from the hallway, boots, fast, precise, not chaotic, coordinated. I turned toward the sound just in time to see two men in dark jackets sweep past the receptionist's desk. Behind them, a woman strode in with a badge already raised. "FBI, everyone remain where you are." The entire office seemed to inhale, and then hold its breath. I didn't move. I didn't have to. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one being questioned. The agents moved fast, efficient. One stayed at the door, blocking any escape. Another began gathering files from the desk, ignoring Richard's protests. "Is this a mistake?" he said loudly, his voice rising in pitch. "I don't understand. Why are you—" "Sir, step away from the documents." "I'm her father," he barked. "This is a family matter." The female agent, a sharp-eyed woman with her hair pulled into a tight bun, turned to him with practiced calm. "We received an anonymous tip concerning fraudulent activities connected to the Monroe estate," she said evenly. "We've traced multiple irregular account movements, several attempts to pre-forge signature authorizations." Her eyes slid to me. "Miss Monroe, you're not under investigation. You're here as a protected party. Would you prefer to speak privately?" I nodded, too stunned to say yes out loud. Behind me, Marlene had gone ghost white. Her hands trembled in her lap, fingers worrying that shredded tissue into oblivion. Gaines stayed silent. He knew this wasn't just paperwork, it was evidence. As I followed the agent into the hallway, Richard's voice reached me one last time. "Clara, this isn't what you think, please don't let them." But I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking beside the agent, past the front desk, past the startled receptionist, and into a small glass-walled room at the edge of the office. Inside, I finally exhaled. The agent shut the door gently, pulled out a notepad, and asked if I was ready to make a statement. I looked through the glass at Richard, still arguing. Marlene silently crumbling. Gaines motionless, and I knew. Everything had changed. Time slowed down. I could hear the scuff of a chair leg dragging across the tile behind me. The squeak of leather as someone shifted their weight. And somewhere far off, the click of metal against metal. Handcuffs. It didn't sound like justice. It sounded too gentle for what they'd done. Through the glass of the conference room, I watched two FBI agents flank Richard. He didn't resist, but the look on his face, it wasn't fear. It wasn't guilt. It was inconvenience, as if this entire thing was some minor detour on his carefully paved road. Marlene, on the other hand, had folded into herself. When they asked her to stand, she couldn't. Her knees gave out and one of the agents had to help her up. Her lipstick had smudged across her cheek, and she clutched her designer handbag like it was a lifeline. I watched all of it from the other side of the glass. a barrier between what they had tried to make me and who I'd chosen to become. Mr. Gaines didn't flinch when they read him his rights. He simply removed his glasses, folded them neatly, and placed them in his breast pocket, as if he'd been expecting this moment, maybe even prepared for it. "On what charges?" Richard demanded, his voice finally cracking as the cuffs locked around his wrists. "Fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted forgery of financial documents," one agent recited, reading from a folded document, "and potential witness coercion pending further review." "Witness," Marlene whispered, her voice paper-thin. She's just a girl." The female agent turned to her. "That girl, she's the sole legal heir to the Monroe estate, and the reason any of you are going to trial." I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. It wasn't a movie. There was no swelling music, no applause, just the quiet unfolding of consequences that had been chasing them for years, and now finally catching up. The agent who'd led me into the private room returned, offering a chair and a bottle of water. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though my hands still trembled slightly. "Did someone tip you off?" She smiled gently. "Your Aunt Vivian, right?" My throat tightened. She did this. She submitted documents 2 weeks ago, banking discrepancies, forged forms, even notarized statements. We'd already been watching Gaines' firm for a separate case. Your file helped connect the dots. I let that sink in. Vivian hadn't just warned me, she'd saved me. And my mother, she must have known. Maybe not how it would play out, but that it would. She'd laid the breadcrumbs, trusted I'd follow them. "She wanted me to be ready," I murmured. "She did more than that," the agent said, standing. "She made sure you'd be believed." As I walked out of Gaines and Associates, the elevator lobby was filled with murmurs. Staff clustered in corners. Phones buzzed. The whole building was rippling with the aftermath. I stepped into the elevator alone, watched the numbers tick down. When the doors opened onto the lobby, sunlight spilled in through the tall windows. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel it relief. Not complete, not yet, but real, a crack of light in the storm. Outside, I spotted Aunt Vivian standing by her car, arms crossed. She wasn't crying, she didn't smile. She just opened the door for me and waited until I buckled in before pulling away from the curb. "You did it," she said quietly. I looked at her. "No," I said. "We did." The courtroom wasn't what I expected. No sweeping drama. No echoing gavels or tearful confessions. Just linoleum floors, flickering fluorescents, and the kind of worn chairs that sag under the weight of people who have waited too long for justice. I sat quietly near the front, fingers clenched around a folder of documents I knew by heart now. Vivian sat beside me, her hand resting on mine, not guiding, just grounding. Richard was on the other side of the room, behind a glass barrier. No tie. Orange jumpsuit. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was bored, like this entire process was beneath him. Marlene wasn't present. I'd overheard that she'd been released under conditional surveillance due to medical distress. I didn't care. That wasn't my war anymore. Mr. Gaines, disbarred pending investigation, hadn't even requested bail. But Richard, he'd hired a new lawyer, young, slick, smirking. He was trying to walk out of this with bail, like none of it mattered. Like I'd forget. When the judge asked if I had anything to say before bail was considered, I stood, hands steady, voice calm. "I'm not here to block my father's bail," I said, looking Richard directly in the eyes. "I'm here to ask for a financial restraining order." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain." I held up the folder. For years, Richard Monroe manipulated financial documents to siphon money from family trusts, businesses, and most recently, from the estate my mother left in my name. I stepped forward and placed the folder on the clerk's desk. Inside, you'll find notarized copies of forged signatures, including my own, attached to asset transfer forms I never saw. Bank movement logs show attempts to reallocate funds before my mother's will was even read. I'm requesting a full freeze on any financial activity initiated by Richard Monroe, including accounts held jointly or through aliases. The judge flipped through the documents, eyes narrowing. "Your mother's accountant corroborated these records." "Yes, Your Honor, and so did the bank and the notary." I felt Richard's stare like static. He wasn't used to being spoken about. He was used to controlling the room. Not anymore. The judge set the folder aside and nodded once. Bail is granted under conditional monitoring, she ruled. But all personal and joint accounts associated with the defendant are to be frozen immediately, pending a full forensic audit. No assets may be accessed, transferred, or liquidated, and any violation of this order will result in immediate revocation of bail. Richard stood slowly. But this time he didn't speak, didn't protest, because the real sentence wasn't the handcuffs, it was the loss of control. Outside the courthouse, the wind felt different, cooler, lighter. Vivian and I stood on the steps for a long time before she finally asked, "How do you feel?" I thought about it, about everything. The dinner table tension, the whispering behind closed doors, the document in the bathroom, the way they tried to turn love into leverage. "I feel steady," I said. She smiled. "You sound like her." Later that night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the same porch where I'd first opened Mr. Lively's letter, where the fight had quietly begun. Now it was ending, not with revenge, not with fury, but with boundaries, with truth, with something I finally recognized in myself, not just strength, but peace. 2 years later, I stood behind a wooden podium in a sun-drenched university auditorium. The banner above me read, "Chilane College Graduation, Class of 2027. My palms were damp, not from nerves, from the weight of everything this moment meant. When the dean called my name as student speaker, a ripple of applause moved through the crowd. In the front row, Aunt Vivian sat next to Mr. Lively, both dressed for the occasion, both dabbing at the corners of their eyes. I looked out at the sea of faces, then down at the simple speech I'd written. It wasn't about GPA or accolades, it was about survival. "When I was 19, I began, I thought inheritance was just about money." A few polite chuckles. "But I've learned that it's about more than that. Inheritance is a test. It shows you who believes you're strong enough to hold something and who hopes you're still too small to see what they're trying to take." Silence now. Listening silence. My mother passed away and left me everything on paper. But what she really left was trust. In me, in my judgment, and I almost gave it away. Because grief makes you doubt your own instincts, and love, when twisted, can sound an awful lot like guilt. I glanced at Vivian. She nodded, slow and proud. "I had to learn through trial and error and more courtrooms than I ever want to see again, that protecting what someone gives you isn't selfish. It's sacred." My voice didn't tremble. "Not this time. I now teach financial literacy workshops at local shelters and girls' schools. Not because I want to talk about money, but because I want young women to understand something no one ever told me. You don't owe your silence to keep peace. You don't owe access just because someone calls you family. And you don't owe forgiveness to those who built a life on your obedience." Applause began to swell, but I hadn't finished. "Finally," I said, pausing, "I want to thank someone who isn't here, but who is everywhere I go." I looked up past the rafters, beyond the windows. My mother, Willa Monroe, who sold her bookstore to buy me a future and trusted I'd fight to keep it safe. I stepped back from the podium as the room rose to its feet. After the ceremony, I walked across campus to a quiet brick building with ivy-covered windows. A new addition. A gift funded entirely by the estate I had defended, down to the last cent. Above the carved oak doorway, a bronze plaque read, "The Willa Monroe Learning Library for Girls Who Don't Apologize for Dreaming." Inside, shelves lined with donated books wrapped around a cozy sunlit space. Desks, beanbags, chalkboards filled with bold handwriting. A space for growth. A space for truth. A space no one could take away. That evening, back at the house, I curled up in my mother's old reading chair with a cup of mint tea. The same candle burned on the table beside me, sandalwood and amber. The house was quiet, but never empty. I could still feel her here, not haunting, just present, like she was saying, "You made it."